Some of these things, I'm sure you people, some of you have probably heard me say this earlier, but when I came to Canada first time, that was in 1961. I was 23-year-old. And the reason I'm mentioning this, that I had never until then met anybody who called himself a Christian. And although I discovered soon that there were more Christians in India at that time than there were in Canada. But the whole Canadian population is less than 3% of the population of India. So I may have sat next to somebody who was a Christian, but how would I know? They don't have horns. So I had no idea that I had ever met a Christian, as far as I was aware. And of course, a big organization called Varsity Christian Fellowship, they were very eager to convert me to Christianity because they kept telling me otherwise I'll be burning in hell for the whole of my life unless I become a Christian. And then, of course, they had some nice young ladies. I was 23 years old. They found their own special feminine way of trying to convert me to Christianity. But they didn't quite succeed because I soon realized that these guys didn't know any damn thing about Christianity, as far as I could see. But they were very eager to convince me that I'm going to burn in hell unless I become a Christian. So I kept asking them, do you think the Buddha is burning in hell? They did not know how to answer this, but from their point of view, that would be probably true. But then soon, but one of the advantages of meeting them was they gave me a copy of the Bible, which I very carefully read. And I was particularly struck by John's Gospel. And some of you may already know, but several years later, I ended up even writing a whole book on John's Gospel because whenever I spoke to my friends, lovely things in the gospel, they say, well, that's not in the gospel. They were all Christian background, but basically that means they weren't reading a damn thing about Christianity. They just are Christian nominally. They go to church only at funerals or weddings. Otherwise, they are just Christians. I was really completely surprised. It's the same thing everywhere else. It's not only in Christianity what I'm saying. Same thing is true for the so-called Hindus. How many of them are following any teaching of Krishna? But life goes on like this. In any case, I was very struck by John's gospel. And as I said, whenever I spoke to some of my Christian friends what the gospel is saying, they were surprised. So that was the reason why it got published. I am not a publisher or a writer by nature, but somehow, because if I'm interested in something, partly coming from the physics background, you don't easily buy what anybody else is saying. You have to make your own measurements. So I wasn't just easily buying what anybody else was saying about John's gospel. I needed to study it myself carefully. Later on, I was told by a Christian scholar that apparently no non-Christian had ever written an exegesis of the whole Gospel of John. I was completely surprised to hear that. But that's not my remark. This is a well-known Christian scholar who said that. But just because I was coming from India, I was just assumed to be a Hindu. The fact is that I was 9 years old when India and Pakistan were divided, and I could, from the veranda of my house, could see people killing each other. And therefore, I was so much against religion, I went absolutely out of my way never to go to a temple, never to study anything to do with religion, just because religion was just fighting with each other. But now, since they were always asking me to speak as a Hindu, to have sort of Hindu-Christian dialogue kind of thing. So I really felt obliged to learn something about Hinduism. The fact is that I learned more about Hinduism in my first year in Canada than I did in 23 years in India, because I went absolutely out of my way to study this deeply. And then I was particularly struck by a remark actually of Vivekananda, who is often regarded as the Hindu monk of India. He made this remark that if I were in Jerusalem with Christ, I would have washed his feet not only with water, but with the blood of my heart. Clearly, any sensible person reading, hearing the teachings of Christ could not be touched by him. And it's obvious all his remarks convey that, but everything he did or said, almost love is oozing out of him. And which then itself is not so surprising, because later on I also read, first letter of John actually says, God is love. Literally, God is love. And twice this is repeated, by the way. If you're interested, you should read the first letter of John. And he who is in love is in God, or with God. So if Christ could say, as he honestly did say, even though he was persecuted for that the Father and I are one, so then he's obviously intimately connected with the very meaning of love. So love oozes out of him. Every remark of Christ has the word love in it, including love your enemies. 3 billion Christians, how many of them are loving their enemies would be good for me to know. So teachings of all the great teachers are very difficult actually to follow in life. In fact, a remark of Christ, this is in the Gospel of Thomas, a non-canonical gospel. He who is near me is near the fire. He who is far from me is far from the kingdom. This is not my remark, this is Christ's remark. And even the person who was, as it were, initiating Christ to start teaching, actually said that although I am bringing the only by water, but the one who is to come, namely referring to Christ, he will initiate you with fire and spirit. Christ's teaching is asking for a complete freedom from me, me, me. This is actually the root of all the teachings that, as far as I can see. But let me continue with this. Then a few years later, another Christian movement called Student Christian Movement, they were organizing a 5-day long webinars, or webinar may not be the right word, actual in-person seminars about different aspects of religion. And this may surprise people here that until about 19, I think almost 1970, even if you went to a bookstore, even the stores dealing with biblical books, there were no books dealing with any mysticism in Christianity. After that, largely because a famous written by Harvey Cox called Turning East, there was more emphasis on meditation and mysticism, etc. Then later on, you can find some books like this. But in any case, in fact, in this particular gathering over 5 or 6 days, people were speaking about different aspects of religion, but absolutely nobody was willing to speak about mysticism. In fact, a Protestant minister said to me, mysticism is just a heresy of the Catholics. It has nothing to do with Christianity. I'm literally quoting him. This is just the heresy of the Catholics, nothing to do with Christianity. So in this gathering of very highly regarded scholars, some of them were world-known scholars, a Jewish rabbi, etc. There was a young man, me, a graduate student in physics, speaking about mysticism. Just goes to show, partly because of my increasing interest in trying to understand what the Christ teaching was and trying to relate with it rather than just quoting this or that. So that is partly the background I'm giving here. Then from a Hindu point of view, this remark of Vivekananda that I just made, there was another remark of it which very much struck me. This is what he said about Christ. If ever a man was God, if ever a man was God on earth, he was Jesus. He was the great soul, the great power, the great teacher. Vivekananda is not something to be dismissed in the Hindu context. He's actually often, his pictures are shown underneath, they would say, the Hindu monk of India. I mean, he's highly regarded as the Hindu monk of India. And these are his remarks about Christ. Clearly, he was very struck by the quality of his life, quality of Christ's life, and the quality of his teaching. And increasingly, certainly, that very much struck me as I tried to come across this. And then another thing which I was very concerned about, actually, what takes place in Hinduism, very strong emphasis, largely brought, in fact, by a remark of Shankara, who is a very highly regarded philosopher in India. I am personally not a great fan of him, but nevertheless, he's probably regarded as the most important philosopher in India, Shankara. And this is what he said: Brahma Satya Jagat Mithya, in Sanskrit. But literally, it means this is the one sentence of his which gets repeatedly mentioned, that only Brahma is true and right, but the whole manifested universe is illusion. And consequently, a very strong emphasis, even in the Upanishad, Mundaka Upanishad, for example, or even in the Bhagavad Gita, very strong emphasis that if you are really enlightened, then you won't be born again. As if being born is a bad idea. To do anything on the planet is a bad idea, because this is just illusion. This had so struck me as a very strange attitude, and in fact, but before it struck me, let me remind you, this was the very thing that the Buddha tried to also correct in the so-called Hindu tradition. Some of you probably know the so-called famous Bodhisattva vow. What is their vow? They will be born again and again until every blade of grass is enlightened. Now, to be sure, that's an impossible vow. But nevertheless, what are they saying? They're not against being born again and doing something on the planet. But the so-called whole attitude coming from Shankara in particular, as if it doesn't matter what the hell goes on in the world, it is just all illusion anyway. Consequently, India could be ruled over by other countries, other nations. It all just goes on. It's just illusion. So that whole attitude, from my point of view, was absolutely terrible attitude in India. And I was very struck by the fact that in the Christian tradition, for example, the Lord's Prayer, thy will be done on earth as it is in heaven. There is no suggestion that just go to heaven and forget about the earth. And Christ himself, what is all his teachings? Not only loving your neighbor, but even loving your enemies. Where do you find that in the Indian context? And what has happened, although maybe I should take a little side note here, the major, from a philosophical point of view, the major difference between the fundamental ideas in the whole of the Abrahamic tradition, by which I mean Judaism, Christianity, and Islam on the one side, and the whole of the Indian tradition, including Hinduism, Buddhism, Jainism, Sikhism, one fundamental idea that brings about a very major change or shift between the two is, in the Abrahamic tradition, we have a myth of creation, and there are very different levels. As you, since most of you are coming from the Christian background, so I hardly need to tell you, there are 9 orders of angels, and then human beings, then animals, then plants, rocks. One level cannot ascend to the other level. No human being could become an angel. Or if anybody pretended this or tried this or said this, for example, Christ saying this, the Father and I are one, he's crucified. Al-Haraj in Islam, the same thing. And even Lucifer, who was the highest of all angels, you can read this in Prophet Isaiah, he wished to be like the Most High, so he's expelled from heaven. Whereas in the Indian tradition, there is not a myth of creation. There is what I call a myth of emanation. The whole universe, absolutely everything, is emanating from the substance of Brahma. Brahma is the label for the highest reality. Literally, it actually means the vastness or the largeness, or sometimes the English word vastness doesn't convey the sense in time so much. So Annie Besant translates this as the eternal. But in any case, the point I'm simply making, it has no, God gets called he in the Abrahamic tradition. Why? Why not she? But in any case, Brahma doesn't have a gender, so it is a neuter. But the suggestion is that everything that exists has a particle of Brahma in it, even the rocks, creatures, human beings, certainly, and then call to anybody who would listen, and therefore gets emphasized at the human level, is to find that deepest part in you, which is identically the same as Brahma. This is among the four major, what are called the Mahavakyas, or the great enunciation in the whole Upanishads. One of them is, I am Brahma. Christ saying the Father and I are one, he's in trouble. In India, anybody who deserves to say, any fool like me could say that. That's not what makes it true. Truth is not an expression of truth. Truth has to do with the quality of the speaker rather than the expression of the truth. And so, therefore, anybody could say that. That's not the important thing. But does anybody, for example, Yajnavalkya actually said that, Raman could say that. But when it comes to the quality of the person, for them to say that I am Brahma is a highly valued pronunciation, remark. Unlike that, they need to be crucified. There are many other changes that come from it. One of them is that everything has Brahma in it. By the way, Krishna in the Bhagavad Gita more or less conveys the same idea, slightly differently. I don't want to go into the details of this because of the limitation of time. But the suggestion, therefore, is to look deeper and deeper to find this, what is called the supreme identity. Namely, your deepest self is identically the same as the highest reality. That is called the supreme identity in the Indian tradition. Which is, and from this, many very important consequences result from this one basic difference. That in the Abrahamic tradition, the levels are more or less completely divided levels. In the Indian tradition, it's like that. Continuity. And the call is for every creature, even for an animal, ultimately to be able to find that deepest part in oneself, which is identically the same as Brahma. Therefore, many consequences come from this. One is there is much less emphasis on individuality. Individuality means remaining myself separated from this one divine energy. Whereas in the Abrahamic tradition, one remains an individual even after death. One may be permanently in heaven or permanently in hell, but one remains unique, individual. And individuality has many consequences. Individualism basically means me, me, me. Look at, since the 16th century, every country in the planet has been ruled by people coming from Christian background. Partly because the secular and religious powers got mixed together, especially in England, since most of you are in England. The moment somebody becomes the king or the queen, they become the head of the church. This will be considered completely odd from the perspective of India. Even traditionally, if you look at any stories in the Mahabharata or the Ramayana, if a wandering monk comes into the court, the king stands up and would like to touch his feet. So it's a very different attitude, which results from, on the one hand, emphasis on lack of individual freedom from individuality. On the other side, occupation with individuality, becoming individualism. So every good thing, or every, actually this is an interesting remark, every stick has two ends. Every good idea has the other side to it. One needs to look at it very carefully. on the one hand, one can just forget about this world and not to take care of it, which is what I try to point out is one of the difficulties coming from the Indian tradition, which had very much struck me when encountering the Christian tradition, taking care of this world, of your neighbors, enemies, etc. And then also a very strong emphasis, even the remark of Christ, whatever you do for the least among you, you do it for me. That kind of, and he touched the feet, or washed the feet of all his disciples. That kind of humility, if anybody can point this out to me in the Indian tradition, I'll be surprised. There is a very strong kind of hierarchy in the Indian tradition. Now, you see, as I said, everything has a good end and a bad end. What it is coming from are the levels of spiritual understanding. There is a hierarchy. This is why so-called democracy, which doesn't consider anything to do with the spiritual level, is not acceptable from the Indian point of view, deep down, simply because obviously there are different levels. Buddha is at a different level than I am. It's obvious. And the call is to enhance one's quality of understanding, quality of one's being. In fact, there is a famous book written called Homo Hierarchicus, which is actually a study of the society in India. It's called Homo Hierarchicus. But then everything, as I said, has two ends, every stick. What happens that people who happen to be born Brahmins, not that they have become Brahmins. Actually, in the Rig Veda, very strong suggestion that everybody is first of all born a Shudra, which is the lowest class or lowest caste. But then one can, depending on one's quality or one's intention, one's ability, one can come to either you take care of the world, so you become Vaishya, or if you have to protect the world, you become a Kshatriya, or if you are more or less driven to wisdom and understanding, you become a Brahmin. But then now it has just become by birth. If my father happens to be a Brahmin, so I am a Brahmin. And what has happened, I remind you here, on the one hand, it is fine to say that everything is Brahma, very nice, but most Brahmins would not even allow the shadow of a Shudra to fall on them. Vivekananda, whose name I just mentioned earlier, this is his remark, not mine, that Brahmins have turned Hinduism into don't touchism. So you see, every good idea has this negative side. One needs to be very careful about this. So for me personally, as you can now see, why I'm pointing out what had struck me about the Christian teaching. And on the other hand, then since I was actually in the physics department, I was doing my PhD in physics when I came. Nobody there among my fellow graduate students had any interest in religion. As far as they were concerned, science was the only avenue to truth. Religion is just nonsense. But they would still go to church only at the time of somebody's funeral or somebody's wedding. Otherwise, they had no interest in this. I could not persuade any of my fellow graduate students to. I keep pointing out to them the remarkable teachings of Christ, and especially in the Gospel of John. They said, "Oh, you're just a fool." And one day I actually heard one of my fellow students saying to the other quietly, "Well, he's from India." That meant he could be crazy. But he's from India. But none of them had any interest in religion of any kind. And what I gradually discovered that obviously there are exceptions to everything that I'm saying or everything that exists in the world. There are exceptions. Probably out of 8 billion people now on the planet, I would be surprised if more than 1,000 are actually really searching for anything true spiritually. But probably there are. Maybe even there may be more. I don't know them. But always the very strong requirement, the one fundamental call, basic call from every teacher, the Buddha, Christ, Krishna, Patanjali, you can read any of the great teachers. The fundamental requirement is to be free of me, me, me. It gets expressed in varieties of ways. For example, Christ's remark in the Gospel of Matthew, Unless you leave yourself behind, you cannot be a follower of me. Or sometimes it gets, unless you die to yourself or you die to the world. Krishnamurti often used to use that kind of expression. Unless you die, you cannot know what is true. Not dying in the sense of committing suicide, it's really more to do with dying to one's attachment to me, which is what occupies everybody, including myself, most of the time. So this is the fundamental requirement. You look at the heart of the teaching of the Buddha or of Christ or Krishna, anybody. Since I have spent a fair amount of time doing all this, I have only a few years left now on this planet. I can guaranteedly say this is the one common feature, common call of all the great teachers. More or less complete freedom from me. That also then requires a serious self-study to see what stands in my way. It's all very nice to say this is a good idea, very strongly emphasized in the Bhagavad Gita or in the Patanjali's Yoga Sutra, but you can read the whole of the Bible. There is not a single entry under self-study or self-knowledge or self-inquiry. But the moment you look at, for example, Gospel of Thomas, which is a non-canonical gospel, let me actually directly quote it to you just from my memory. Kingdom of God is within you as well as outside you. If you would know God, you must know yourself. When you know yourself, you will realize that you are the Son of the living Father. If you do not know yourself, you are in poverty. In fact, you are poverty. Very strong remark, but it's a non-canonical gospel. How many people in the church are being told to have self-inquiry? So my friend, finally I did meet one or two people who were seriously searching, and gradually we both spoke about this, how to be, each one of us, doesn't matter whether you come from India or Pakistan or Bangladesh or come from Canada, each one of us is naturally very strongly influenced by the major religious background there. For example, I see right now my two kids who were born in Canada, they're living in Canada. When they were young, and even now in their schools, they are no longer in school. What do we have? Christmas holiday or Easter holiday? Not when the Buddha was enlightened. And then there are Christian prayers. Quite not to be against any of this. All I'm saying is that absolutely everybody, wherever they are born, whichever society they are living in, is very deeply, strongly influenced by the whole cultural background. They may be for it or against it, but they're still very much influenced by it. Then, if the call is, as I just earlier said, at the heart of all teaching, the call is to be free of me. That me is very much influenced by my cultural background, including my religious background. So it becomes particularly important to be, how to be, not to be against me. That's not what any of these teachers are saying. Because me is required to survive in the world. Otherwise, how is one going to continue? But to be free of something doesn't mean to be against something. And therefore, to be free of my own conditioning by my religious background doesn't require for me to be against Hinduism or my Christian friend to be against Christianity, but also to begin to realize that at the very best, any teaching, any religion is at the very best like a finger pointing to the moon. If you get so attached to the finger, you will never get to the moon. How to be free of the finger. In fact, this is why I gradually shifted to comparative religions. To become aware of two fingers pointing to the moon can assist you to locate it more easily. But to get so stuck to any finger, you'll never get to the moon. So I feel that when we speak about freedom from me, it also requires a certain, not to be against that, but to have a certain freedom from whatever my religious background is. In fact, I have even said that even in writing, some of my Hindu friends get upset by this. I even said that I was born a Hindu. That's what they keep labeling me. It's not my decision. Did I decide to be born a Hindu? Did you decide to be born a Christian or whatever? But whatever happened, in any case, I was born a Hindu. But I will be very sad if I die merely a nominal Hindu. Why can't I learn something from Christ or Rumi or Socrates? To be stuck at some, this is partly to do with the overall scientific background. In the scientific idea, just because Newton, who happened to be English, brought the law of gravitation doesn't mean that no Chinese can understand the law of gravitation or can learn anything from it or can't change it or bring any. Einstein was not English. He actually made a change in Newton's laws of motion by bringing special theory of relativity. So that is really partly the scientific perspective, that one doesn't need to get stuck to one particular place or particular religious background. But that doesn't mean one has to be against any of this. So this Christian friend of mine, one or two of them, seriously interested in this, were particularly struck by the teaching in the Indian tradition that ultimately one needs to connect with the divine energy. For them to say anything like this in the Christian tradition would get them into trouble, to become one with God. And then some of them, partly because in the last, I think, 3 decades, more and more yoga practices have emerged throughout the Western world now. In fact, there are more yoga practitioners outside India than there are in India. and and so some of them are struck by that, especially most of them are just basically doing physical yoga to increase their sex appeal, but some of them take it slightly more seriously, and to see the whole call in the yoga. Anybody can read any of the yoga books, Bhagavad Gita or Yoga Sutra. These are the two major texts of yoga. The call really is to be free of me, expressed in varieties of ways, but that's the call. So that one can relate with reality without interjection from my notion, my understanding, my clarity. So some of these yoga practitioners get naturally, they also end up reading the yoga books, etc. Then they get struck by a call being, and then more and more understanding that in the material world in which we live, it is silly to be against individuality. On the other hand, if individuality basically leads to individualism, me, then one needs to be careful. So then how to find the right balance? Similarly, in the Indian tradition, it comes from the whole myth of emanation, oneness of all there is. It's nice to say that, but as I just pointed out, a Brahmin won't let a Shudra come near him or sit at the same table, but all is one is very nice to say that. But on the other hand, also to appreciate the uniqueness of everything, because in the manifested world, everything is unique. Even a blade of grass is different from every other blade of. There is a lot of scientific data about this, which is why when they were trying to do this in the medical practice, try to do what they call a system for the whole human beings, it has to be statistical, because every human being has more items of distinction from every other human being than there are atoms in the universe. I can give you references for that if you wish. So every person is absolutely unique, but there are many things in common. So all medicine, all modern medicine is statistical. Particular medicine helps this way, that way, most people, and then it can also do a lot of damage to somebody else, and it goes on simultaneously. So In any case, coming back to this suggestion from some of these two or three serious searchers in the Christian tradition, very struck by the Hindu tradition of ultimately oneness of all there is and freedom from me, as much as one can get, although this is common to all traditions as far as I can see. But then practice of yoga very much assisted them, and also much more emphasis in the Indian texts. As I just mentioned, Yoga Sutra and Bhagavad Gita will be two texts if you were to compare with the Bible in the Abrahamic tradition. They very much emphasize self-inquiry, both of them, very strongly, which is really required to be able, how can I be free of something unless I know what it is that I need to be free of? Because in principle, even the scientists would agree with this, in principle, the whole external cosmos is mirrored inside each one of us. But that also means not only the divine energy is there, but there is also the demon is also there, because he's also part of the universe. And one will soon discover in oneself all of these tendencies, and therefore very strong emphasis to work with some fellow searchers so that one doesn't become either have a fantasy that I am specially chosen by God, I should kill all the infidels, like many jihadis do, or that I am the only devil one, and therefore I'm afraid. Even the Buddha, actually, before he was enlightened, made this remark. Mara, which is the Satan in Pali, Mara, you are a part and parcel of myself. And when Christ is tested by Satan, Christ doesn't ask him to disappear or go to hell. He asks him to get thee behind me, Satan. You can read this yourself in the Gospels. These are not just my remarks. Satan has a hell of a lot of energy, but it can also, in fact, let me remind you, this may be useful for some of you to know. In Sanskrit, in Pali, where Mara comes from, Pali is a form of Sanskrit. And in Hebrew, Satan, both of them actually mean obstacle. What stands in my way? And actually to encounter one Satan is in fact to find out what is standing in my way, what I need to then overcome, gradually to overcome it. So therefore, just to get against Satan, to ask him to go to hell or to disappear is not going to help. Which is also the reason why a very strong suggestion in most serious teachings to work with other fellow searchers, so that you don't either have fantasy about I am specially chosen, or have the fear that I have a demon, nobody else has it. Every human being is a microcosmos of the large cosmos. Whatever is true deep down for me is true for every other human being deep down. So gradually, these friends of mine, a couple of them, got quite interested in the Indian tradition simply because of sense of oneness or sense of unity with all is at least theoretically the case. Whether in practice a Brahmin won't sit next to a Shudra eating lunch, that's a different problem. The practice, just as I said, also you look in the Christian tradition, how many people are loving their enemies or even their neighbors. What is taking place? So the actual practice of any serious spiritual teaching is very hard, simply because it requires a complete freedom from my desire, my wish, my acquisition, my improvement, etc. Me, or sometimes one can say me, my mind. That is the call from every serious spiritual teaching, as far as I can see.